Something strange happened in the middle of a war scare in the world's most important oil choke point. A cabinet secretary posted that the U.S. Navy had escorted an oil tanker through the Strait of Hormuz. Oil prices reacted, and then the White House said it wasn't true. That is not a normal mistake. Not at that level, and not with that price tag, because the Strait of Hormuz isn't just another patch of water on the map. Before this conflict, about 20% of global petroleum consumption moved through that narrow route. So tonight we're going to treat this like a courtroom. We're going to lay out what was said, what was undone, and what was happening behind the scenes while the public was being told everything was under control. And the real question is not whether one tweet was mislabeled. The real question is who is driving the story of this war, and who benefits when the story keeps changing. Because once you start pulling on this thread, it doesn't just lead to the Pentagon, it leads to the Justice Department. It leads to a massive sanctions case involving Iran. It leads to new reporting about the president's son-in-law raising billions from the same region. He's helping negotiate in. And when all of those things line up in the same week, you don't just have a messy news cycle. You have a pattern, a dangerous one. Let's start with the simplest piece of evidence, a post, a claim, and then a reversal, because this is where the timeline matters. And in this story, timing is everything. In early March, as the U.S.-Israel war with Iran escalated, shipping through Hormuz became more than a business story. It became a risk calculation, a captain's decision, a boardroom panic, and a global markets event. Then came the post from Energy Secretary Chris Wright. The now-deleted statement said the Navy had unsuccessfully escorted an oil tanker through the Strait of Hormuz to ensure oil remains flowing to global markets. That sounds official. It sounds like policy. It sounds like a new phase of the conflict. But the White House press secretary later told reporters the United States had not yet escorted any oil tankers or vessels through the strait. So what happened? The Energy Department's explanation was that the clip was incorrectly captioned by Department of Energy staff. Just a caption. Just staff. Just an oops. But here's the problem, a serious one. Because a caption moved markets. CNBC reported the mistaken post sent oil prices plunging more than 17% at their lows that day. Think about that. One government account, one claim of naval protection, and the price of oil falls off a cliff. A cliff. That's not just misinformation. That's leverage. And in a war, leverage is power. Now, if this were an isolated incident, maybe you could shrug it off. Maybe you'd call it a chaotic staff error. But the next evidence point makes that defense much harder. Because 2 days later, Chris Wright went on CNBC and said something blunt. He said the U.S. Navy is not ready to escort oil tankers through Hormuz. Not ready? Not now, he said. It'll happen relatively soon, but it can't happen now. We're simply not ready. So let's translate that into plain language. The public heard, we're already escorting. Then the White House said, we're not escorting. Then the Energy Secretary said, we can't escort yet. That is not a communications mix-up. That is a live contradiction. And contradictions are the kind of thing prosecutors love, because contradictions mean someone is either mistaken or someone is selling a story. And this is where the story changes again. Because while all of this was happening, there were real military actions around Hormuz. Reuters reported the U.S. military said it eliminated in 16 Iranian mine-laying vessels near the Strait of Hormuz. Not a might, not a could. Reuters described it as already done. So on one hand, you have official statements implying stability. On the other hand, you have active strikes and mine threats. And those two pictures do not fit together neatly. They clash. And that clash raises the next question. What was the president telling the public during this period? Because if the administration can't keep a simple escort claim straight, you have to ask what they're saying about the bigger thing. The war, the risks, the plan. If there is a plan, now we get to exhibit B. A statement from the president that on its face sounds like bravado, but under pressure starts to sound like something else. Donald Trump told Fox News that ships should show some guts and sail through the Strait of Hormuz, arguing they had nothing to fear. That line is memorable. Simple, and it's made for television. But it also does something else. It shifts the burden. It quietly turns a national security problem into a personal courage test for private ship captains. And that is a revealing move. Because when governments have control, they don't tell civilians to show guts. They provide protection. They provide protection. They provide credible deterrence. They provide credible deterrence. So why wasn't that happening here? Wright's CNBC interview gives one answer. He said U.S. military assets were focused on destroying Iran's offensive capabilities and the manufacturing industry that supplies those capabilities. In other words, the Navy was not positioned to do the escort mission at that moment, and that matters. Because now the president to show some guts aligned stops sounding like a strategy and starts sounding like a gap. A gap between what the White House wanted to project and what the military could safely deliver. And here's the tension spike. That gap can get people killed. Now we move to Exhibit C. The coalition story the administration floated that allies would be part of an escort effort. Then the president publicly shifted tone, saying the U.S. didn't need help while still talking about other countries joining anyway. That's not just mixed messaging. That's diplomatic whiplash. And it creates a second kind of risk, not just military risk, credibility risk. Credibility risk. Because in coalition warfare, credibility is currency. And when the president says, in effect, we don't need you, and then asks again, he burns that currency twice. Once with the ask, and again with the insult. And now we have to ask the courtroom question. Why keep doing this? Why keep making definitive claims, then walking them back? Why keep promising big moves, then admitting the U.S. isn't ready? And why does the story keep turning into performance? Because this is where the case stops being about a strait and starts being about as straight. So let's widen the frame. While the Hormuz messaging was breaking down, major legal and financial stories were moving at the same time. And that's where the story becomes complicated, because these aren't random headlines. They touch the same core issues: Iran, money, and influence. Let's talk about sanctions. Specifically, the most significant Iran sanctions case involving a foreign bank. Reuters reported that the U.S. government agreed to resolve its long-running criminal prosecution of Turkey's state-run lender Halkbank through a deferred prosecution agreement. Prosecutors had accused the bank of helping Iran evade American sanctions. And Reuters said prosecutors alleged the bank secretly transferred $20 billion of restricted funds and used schemes involving gold cash and fake food shipments to justify oil proceeds transfers. That number is not small. It's enormous, and yet the agreement described by Reuters included no payment and said charges would likely be dismissed after a compliance monitor reviews the bank's actions. So during an active conflict atmosphere with Iran at the center of global attention, a major Iran sanctions case moves toward resolution. That timing alone raises eyebrows, and not because deferred prosecution agreements are automatically wrong. It can serve real policy goals. Here's the problem: a reluctant ally, anyone but the chain of command. And that brings us to the defense argument, because every case is one. The strongest defense of the administration would go like this. That's caption. Deleted quickly, no harm intended. Second, naval escorts are complex. You don't just turn them on. The Energy Secretary's point was that the U.S. is preparing, but assets are currently focused on striking Iran's offensive capabilities. Third, deferred prosecution agreements like the Halkbank deal are standard tools. They can force compliance changes, restrict future Iran-linked transactions, and serve broader diplomatic goals, especially with a NATO ally like Turkey. Fourth, the DOJ filing in the Smirnov case could be framed as a technical legal matter about plea terms, not about Russia. And fifth, Kushner could argue that he is following ethics rules and that fundraising doesn't automatically change U.S. policy. That is the best version of the defense. Now here's the rebuttal. And it's not emotional. It's logical. Because critics don't need to prove a grand conspiracy to raise alarms. They only need to show that the system is producing predictable outcomes. Start with the right post. If a miscaptioning can wipe out 17% from oil prices in a day, then the administration's communications are effectively a market weapon, whether intentional or not. And if it's not intentional, that's still bad, because then it's incompetence in a space where incompetence costs billions. Next on escorts, if the U.S. isn't ready to protect commercial shipping, then telling ships to show guts becomes more than rhetoric. It becomes a way to pressure private actors into taking risks the government can't currently reduce. That's not courage, that's outsourcing danger. Then the Health Bank case. Yes, deferred prosecution agreements are tools. But Reuters reported prosecutors alleged $20 billion in restricted funds were moved through the scheme. So critics ask, if this is the moment for maximum pressure on Iran-linked networks, why is a $20 billion case moving toward dismissal with no money changing hands? And even if the answer is diplomacy, the optics are brutal. And optics shape alliances too. Now Smirnov. Mother Jones reported prosecutors described extensive Russian contacts that were not benign. So when DOJ leadership supports his attempt to unwind the plea and sentence, critics don't just see a legal technicality. They see a message about who gets help and who doesn't. Finally, Kushner. The Times reported he is seeking $5 billion or more while serving as a key Middle East negotiator. And that's Saudi Arabia's PIF already invested $2 billion. Even if every rule is followed, the incentive structure looks backwards. It invites foreign governments to believe they can gain influence through private financial relationships. And once governments believe that the damage is already done, because deterrence is partly about belief. And this changes what people believe. Now we move to the what happens next day phase. And this is where the consequences get real. If the U.S. does begin escort operations later this month, as Wright suggested might be possible, then the next question becomes risk tolerance. How close will U.S. ships get? What rules of engagement will they use? What happens if Iran tests them? Because in a tight waterway, mistakes don't stay small. They escalate fast. And if the administration continues to send mixed messages, the risk increases. Not just for sailors, for markets, for allies, for anyone trying to make decisions based on U.S. statements. That includes shipping companies. That includes oil importing countries. That includes governments deciding whether to cooperate. And it includes Congress, which may start asking for hearings, documents, and timelines, especially on the question of who approved public claims that moved the oil market. Because again, in a courtroom, you don't just ask what happened. You ask who knew. You ask when they knew it. And you ask why they said the opposite anyway. And that brings us to the ending. Because stories like this rarely feel historic in real time. They feel like noise, a tweet, a walk back. Another headline, another outrage. But sometimes political history isn't defined by one massive speech. Sometimes it's defined by a pattern of small contradictions that reveal a system underneath. A system where public messaging is treated like a lever. A system where policy lanes, war, sanctions, prosecutions, and private fundraising start to overlap in ways the public can't easily track. And a system where the story is always changing because the incentives don't want it to settle. So the final question is not whether the Strait of Hormuz reopens next week. The final question is whether the United States can credibly lead militarily, legally, and diplomatically when its own public story keeps contradicting itself. Because when the story collapses, deterrence collapses with it. And in a place like Hormuz, that's not just embarrassing, it's dangerous. And it changes everything.